In this talk, we're going to discuss sex and how the world has corrupted it. And then we're going to look at what God originally intended for human sexuality. And then we're going to take a look at getting a better grip on the ancient Jewish understanding of blood covenant. And then we're going to sprinkle on top of that some marriage and understand the implications of all of it. Next on Levaire. Hey there, I'm Matthew Shaner, and this is channel Levaire. On this channel, we're going to dive into Christian apologetics and unpack biblical teaching. This talk, we're going to wrestle with human sexuality. We're in a series right now on human sexuality, and suffice it to say, most adults, like if you're watching this, you've probably struggled with either improper sexual urges, sexual promiscuity, misunderstandings around sex, sexual confusion. Like there's a gamut of problems around human sexuality. And so, like, where did we all go wrong on this? There's a couple places, right? One of those places would be Adamic nature. Like, we're all born under Adam, and we all need to be born again, according to Jesus, right? So there's Adamic nature. There's Adamic nurture, just how we were raised. We're raised in the world, and if our parents didn't know any better, then they might have done the best they could if they could. Not all parents were created equal, right? And so many of us were not raised with a healthy understanding of sex. Many of us fed on the world more than we fed on the Word, and we ended up with a lot of broken, false ideas that came to us through the music that we listened to, or the shows that we watched, or the ads that we saw, even those around us, our friends, our family, whatever. And then one final contributor there might be weak church teaching. Like, if the church isn't being salt and light on this particular topic, it's our bad. And so the church has to take some responsibility for the degradation of morals that we see in society, right? The moral rot. So, in this talk, we're going to dive into all of this and get a better sense for, how is human sexuality being corrupted? Like, we see it in the newsstands as we're at the checkout lane at the grocery store, right? Like, you can see it on Cosmo, you can see it on, like, scantily clad women pasted to the covers of magazines who, of course, have been deeply photoshopped. And all of that kind of mixes with, we see sex in shows, we hear about sex in our music. Depends on the music you're listening to. Depends on the shows that you're watching. But the enemy, and frankly, our own flesh, has corrupted sexuality. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Corruption around human sexuality seems to start early and run deep. I know from my own personal experience, by age 3, I was forming crushes on babysitters, pretty young aunts that I had, cousins. And so by kindergarten, I was riding the bus and flirting with the older girls who thought I was cute as a kindergartner. I really liked that. I liked the attention. I remember this. My early crushes were Rainbow Bright and She-Ra. Like, it didn't matter that they were cartoons. I liked the way these characters were drawn. I just liked them. We didn't, like, growing up, we had something called the J.C. Penney catalog in our house. And now, as a young kid, my favorite section in that catalog was the toy section. But my second favorite section in the catalog was the swimsuit and the lingerie sections. Those were kind of fascinating. I really liked those. And later on, so my parents got divorced when I was 8, and when I would go over to my dad's as a young teen, I eventually found just stumbled across his Playboy stash. Later on in my adult life, I took to womanizing and fornication, and I was an adulterer at times. Like a lot of impropriety kind of crept in at this point. And then, I'd wrestled with pornography at one point. And I know this isn't just me, because I've had the opportunity to minister to brothers and sisters in Christ who are wrestling with sexual urges that seem misplaced and just like sexual practices that aren't holy. And I've had the opportunity to be able to counsel with some of those. And even in the last 2 houses that my family has bought, I have uncovered old pornography stashes, presumably from the 2 husbands that lived in each one of these houses, right? And in fact, as we were buying our current home, the husband of that couple passed away. I found his pornography stash. It means he kind of took that to his grave, right? Like, this is a problem in the world. Certainly, this cannot be God's intention for human sexuality. How was it in the beginning? Well, Genesis 1, we see all of creation. Then Genesis 2 kind of recapitulates the creation account, where we see God creating all the plants and all the animals, each after their own kind. God creates man and has man identify all of the animals. He names them all. And at the end of that illustration, God says, there's no right kind for man. Puts Adam to sleep and doesn't make woman out of another lump of clay, but makes woman out of Adam's rib. And in Adam, keep in mind, Adam was full of the glory of God. He was sinless. He was perfect in every way. God made him and said, it is good. And so it wasn't like in the garden, there was no sin, no suffering, no sickness. There was no death, no disease, no decay. And we have this moment where Adam and Eve are walking in the cool of the day with the Lord in his presence, perfect, whole in God, whole in one another, one flesh, one man, one woman together, one flesh, and it is perfect. But then free will happens. After a time, Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This breaks the covenant that they had with God, and sin enters the world. They see their nakedness, they hide from each other, they hide from God. God sacrifices an animal to create skins to cover them. So now blood has been shed on their behalf, and they are ejected from the garden. With a curse, they have to work the land, there's going to be pain in pregnancy or childbearing, and it's a mess, right? As soon as Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, humanity starts a downward spiral into depravity. Within several generations, it is almost a total loss, right? And the world has been populated, but the world has gone to ruin. God hits the reset button, and we have the global flood. Noah and his family are carried through that, and they start over. At the end of the Noah account, or at the end, when they get off of the ark, there is another covenant that's set up. Now, scholars will wrestle with how many major covenants are there in the Bible. Now, I just indicated I believe that there was one covenant in the garden. And that covenant was essentially this. With the covenants, you have the terms of the covenant, and you have the penalties and the blessings being announced over the covenant. And so in the garden, we have, you may eat from any tree, but you can't eat from the one. So you've got full reign, full dominion over the earth. Go forth and multiply. And the only thing you are told not to do is to eat from one tree. And of course, they do that. They do exactly that. And they were told that they were going to die, and die they did. First, they died a spiritual death, so they had the separation from God. So when God's saying, "Where are you?" I bet he's feeling like he knew they were going to do this, right? Like this didn't surprise God that this happened. It's not like he had to then race to come up with a plan. God already knew that this is how free will was going to play out in humanity. And then he wasn't surprised. And so when he asks, "Where are you?" it's actually an invitation for Adam and Eve to confess, to come to him, to say, "Hey." But I think there too might have been a cry of pain on the father's side. If we look at how Christ on the cross cried out from that separation of becoming the curse on the cross, that separation between he and the Father that he hadn't experienced before. I believe there was despair in his voice, and I believe in the garden there was despair in the Father's voice. Where are you? He knew it was coming, but I bet it still hurt. Whatever. So, scholars will argue around how many major covenants there are. Again, I think there's one that happened in the garden. That one's oftentimes not counted. And then there's 5 major covenants that most scholars can agree to, right? They are as follows. The first covenant that we see coming out of the garden, after the garden, is post-flood. Noah, as he departs the ark, God sets his rainbow in the sky and says, essentially, "I will never again destroy the earth with water. You have dominion, go forth and multiply." The next covenant we see is the Abrahamic Covenant, as we see in Genesis 12 and 15. The Abrahamic Covenant establishes that Abraham is going to be the father of many nations, and that the nations will be blessed through his line. The next covenant we see is the Mosaic Covenant. This happens in Exodus. In Exodus and Leviticus, we see the Mosaic Covenant being established. And in that covenant, it establishes what life is to look like with God in a theocracy, or a government that has God in the center of it. Well, this establishes rules for holy conduct. It establishes how they are to engage, or how they are to approach God in their midst, so that they don't die, because they've been separated from God, and their separation, when it meets with God's holiness, their separation doesn't serve them well. Their sin kills them. The presence of sin in them, because they are impure, kills them. And so it's not good. There needs to be sin atonement. There needs to be a covering. And that's where this is taught in this covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. Then we have the Davidic Covenant, where David is told that there will be a king, or the Messiah will come through his line. And then finally in the New Testament, we have Jesus establishing the new covenant with the apostles at the Last Supper before he was crucified, that this covenant was to reestablish relations with God. It was to atone for sin and breathe life back into humanity. So over and over through the Word, we see that God is a covenantal God. We see terms explained, blessings announced, and then, oh, by the way, if these covenants are not kept, curses can come from those as well. So of the major covenants that I just listed, we see blood being present in 3 of them. So in the Abrahamic Covenant, we see animal sacrifice and we see circumcision. In the Mosaic Covenant, we see animal sacrifice and the sprinkling of blood for the atonement of sin. And then finally in the New Covenant, we see Jesus' sacrifice for us on our behalf, blood again. Blood covenants are considered to be the ultimate form of contract. When cutting a blood covenant between 2 parties, it usually looks something like this. First, there is the exchange of coats. One party would take their coat and put it on the other, and the other party would take their coat and put it on the first. What this signified was that all that I have is yours, and all that you have is mine. Next, they would exchange weapon belts. So the first party would give their weapon belt, or they put the weapon belt on the other party, and the second party would put their weapon belt on the first party. And what that meant was my military strength was yours, and your military strength is mine. Your enemies are mine, and my enemies are yours. Your friends are mine, and my friends are yours. My strength is yours. Your strength is mine. If I ever need your help, you'll be there. Next, there would be an exchange of vows in what's called the walk of blood. There would be animal sacrifice. This is where, and forgive me for a moment. So my youngest girl, who holds me accountable for practicing for some of my talks, she has inserted the animals for the animal sacrifice here. And we have here, this is Mr. Lice, and this is Jumpy the cat. And we're going to have to sacrifice these animals right now. So what would happen is they would kill the animal, drain the blood, and then they would take the animal and cut it in half lengthwise. They would take the 2 halves and separate the halves, and then in the middle of the halves would pool the blood. From that place, they would start in the blood, and one party would go around one direction, and the other party would go around in the other direction, forming a figure 8. As they moved into the figure 8, as they completed the figure 8, they would find themselves standing face to face, standing in the blood. And from that point, they would declare the terms of the agreement, and they would declare the blessings and the curses of the agreement. The modern symbol for this one is the exchange of vows in a wedding ceremony. Next, there would be an exchange of names. So whereas a last name of one person might be Brown, and the other person, their last name might be Stone, both people would take each other's names, and so both would then become Brownstone. This was a dissolution of identity, essentially saying the 2 are becoming one in name. The modern symbol today that we see this in is when the wife takes the husband's name, or both spouses agree to take each other's names and they somehow hyphenate it. The next symbol we have is the exchange of blood. So at this point, there would be an incision made either in the hand or in the wrist on both parties, and they would clasp their hands so that the blood would intermingle. At this point, they are declaring that 2 separate bloodlines are becoming one. So the modern symbol for this one, we're going to talk about that in a moment when we discuss Jewish wedding traditions. Next, we have the mark of the covenant. So while the hands are clasped or while the wrists are bound together and the blood is being mingled, there would be a dark substance like charcoal or something like that that would be rubbed into the wounds, and that would make the scars dark when they healed over. This was called the mark of the covenant, and it showed the world that you were in a blood covenant with somebody else. The modern day symbol of this nowadays is the wedding ring. Finally, at the end of all of this, there would be a covenant meal, and that was usually accompanied with bread and wine. They would tear off a piece of bread, and one covenant partner would place bread in the other person's mouth, and the other person would take a piece of bread and place it in their mouth. That's essentially saying, a part of me has gone into you, and a part of you has come into me. Then they would share a drink from the communal cup of wine, and that was symbolizing the same thing. My blood has gone into you, and your blood has gone into me. No longer are we two separate individuals. We are united. We are one people. Or if these were tribal representatives representing entire tribes, that would mean that the two tribes were now one tribe. In modern day wedding ceremonies, we see this when the bride and groom cut the cake, and it's turned into a joke in a lot of ceremonies where they'll smash the cake into into their spouse's faces. But it wasn't meant for that. It was meant to say, part of me is going into you and part of you is coming into me. So it has actually a way holier meaning behind the symbol than just an opportunity to smash cake into your new spouse's face. All of this, by the way, is where the term friend gets its meaning. So Jesus, when he says, "No longer do I call you servants, but I call you friends," I think he does this in John 15. He's saying this. He's saying, no longer do I consider you servants, I consider you friends. And friends means knit together as one. This is the unity that Jesus is indicating when he says friend. These days we have Facebook. You might have a bazillion friends on Facebook that you never talk to, you never see, you maybe have never even met. That's not those kind of friends. This is an intimate kind of friend. Another form of biblical covenant, Jewish marriage, had 3 steps. The first step was contract. The contract was called a ketubah. And the contract, once you sign the ketubah, you were about as married as you're going to get. Like legally, you are bound at that point. And the ketubah oftentimes carried a bride price. If you wanted to step back out of the marriage arrangement, you had to get a divorce paper called a get, and you had to serve the divorce paper. In the marriage, then, there was a bride price that was paid, and there was a dowry that was collected. If you wanted to get out of the marriage, you had to submit the get, but then you would have to give back the bride's dowry unless the bride had been adulterous. If she was caught in adultery or had been unfaithful in some way, you could get out of it without giving the dowry back and without paying the bride price. Oftentimes this bride price was high. It was close to 50 shekels, which was several years worth of labor. We actually see this in the Old Testament with Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. Here, Jacob says yes to Laban for marrying Rachel, and he works for 7 years to earn Rachel's hand in marriage. So at that point, the ketubah was already in place, and he's on the hook for working these 7 years. He works these 7 years, Laban pulls a fast one and brings Leah in. The second step, the consummation, happens between Jacob and Leah. Jacob's like, "What did you do?" And Laban, skeezy guy that he was, says, "Well, I wasn't going to tell you, but yeah, we don't usually let the oldest one not get married first. And so there's an agreement that he will work the next 7 years, and at that point he gets Rachel, but he's still on the hook for working off the bride price. So the ketubah is the exact position that Joseph finds himself in when he discovers that Mary is pregnant. Now the word says that Joseph was a righteous man. Here he was, he had a ketubah, but they hadn't consummated the marriage yet. Consummation, by the way, is the second part in this. And so he figured she had been adulterous, and he was going to serve her again. He was going to divorce her, but he was going to divorce her secretly. Had he divorced her publicly, she would have been shamed, her life would have been shot, and he would have been able to keep her dowry, and he would not have had to pay the bride price. But since he was a righteous man, he was going to do it quietly, which meant he was still going to be on the hook for paying the bride price, and he was going to have to give her entire dowry back. He was a righteous guy. The second step in this biblical covenant is called the consummation. The consummation is also called the huppah, and where the huppah is involved, we've got a virginity cloth that we see referenced in Deuteronomy 22. And what would happen is the couple would have two witnesses. You'd have a witness for the bride and a witness for the groom. This would happen at the bride's house, the bride's father's house, and there would be a special room that's set up for the consummation. So now the bride and groom were going to go and consummate their relationship. Well, the witnesses would stand outside, and upon seeing blood, because the bride, if she was a virgin, there would be the blood from the hymen as the hymen was broken, but then the blood from the man's semen would also mix, and now you've got a blood covenant being stricken between the man and the woman. The virginity cloth would catch some of the blood, and that would be the bride's insurance policy against an unjust divorce later on down the path. So that virginity cloth would be handed to the bride's family so that they could protect her honor, but the bridegroom would shout out and give this declaration. This is what John references when he talks about, John the Baptizer, that is. When John the Baptizer refers to this, this is what he's talking about. In John 3:29, John the Baptizer is speaking to his disciples. He says, "He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full." So the huppah was the term used for the virginity cloth. Over time, the traditions have softened on that. Obviously, there's no virginity cloth being used these days. But the huppah became the canopy over the bed. And then in modern day Jewish marriages, we see a canopy over the bride and groom as they're getting married. The final step in this marriage covenant would be the celebration. There'd be a big party at the end of all this, and the bridegroom, once the partying was done, the bridegroom would take his bride and they would go to the place that the bridegroom had prepared in advance. So after all this, in 1 Corinthians 7, when we see that it's not good for a man to touch a woman, that means with romantic intention. And that's because the flesh doesn't do so well with romantic intention and drawing lines, and it's just not good. The passion tends to lead people into sin in that place. And at the end of the wedding ceremonies, that we even have this today, common wedding ceremonies say, "You may now kiss the bride." Well, that assumes that you haven't kissed her yet. This is why. This teaching is why that exists. Finally, we recognize that sexuality it's a type, right? It is a shadow. The physical is a shadow for the spiritual. It's not the other way around. It's not that the physical is the reality and the spiritual is the shadow. It's actually inverted. And so recognizing that the physical is the shadow and the spiritual is the real, when we see Jesus praying in the garden and he prays to the Father, Father, that they become one in you and I as you and I are one, this is the kind of oneness that Jesus is calling us into. It is a spiritual oneness, not only if we're married and we have a spouse, are we called to be in spiritual oneness with them, but God first, right? We're called into oneness with God and Jesus and Holy Spirit. And so it gets way bigger than just making sure all the parts fit and making sure you're compatible, right? All right, gang. This was it for this teaching. I hope you found this useful. Got any questions, any comments? Put them in the comments below. And do the like, subscribe thing. And I will see you next time. Be sure to keep pressing into the Word, spending time in private prayer, spending time in private worship. That's where growth happens. And remember, it is the truth that sets you free. Bye for now.